it's time for some Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder. Now, Poisonous Concoction is one of the concoction skills unique to the Pathfinder Ascendancy. And luckily, Pathfinder is very well specialized for poisoning enemies, which is perfect because Poisonous Concoction, as the name might imply, is also a poison skill. So, I've put together a build that's a great mapper. I'd say right now my current setup isn't ideal for bossing, though there are a couple of tweaks that you can do that should vastly improve its bossing potential. I do plan to min-max the character more, which means improving the gear and tweaking the setup. So, if that sounds interesting to you, be sure to get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, ring the notification bell. On the other hand, if you want to see my gear in its current form, think of this as a more introductory version of the build. Well, first I'm going to get into a couple of the skills and core mechanics that I'm using. After that, I'm going to start talking about my gear, passives, etc. And finally, I'll wrap everything up with a few more of my gameplay experiences. So first up, a couple quirks from Poisonous Concoction as a skill. It is an unarmed attack. This means it has its own base damage, much like totems, and much like totems, it doesn't attack with your weapon. So the weapon you're holding kind of sort of doesn't matter. But it also kind of sort of does matter, because you can still use global modifiers like skill levels to vastly increase damage. And much like totems, Poisonous Concoction gets quite a lot of base damage from increased skill levels. Also, because it's a skill granted by your Ascendancy, you'll want to be level 90 to get your final support link. All of these quirks mean that Widow Hail is a particularly effective way to scale Poisonous Concoction, since most of the modifiers on your quiver are global, since usually bow builds don't attack with their quiver. But I swear 25 years ago, I saw a guy beat Katava to death with nothing but his bare fists and a quiver. But hey, maybe there was some magic in his gloves or something. As strong as I've found Poisonous Concoction to be so far, I have found that its clear is a little bit limited. You get some poison prolif from being a Pathfinder, but if you really want a bunch of clear, you have to use Plague Bearer. This gives you access to the powerful Plague Nova skill, which is not only able to completely delete rares from existence, but it also massively poisons everything in a big old radius. And much like with Poisonous Concoction itself, this is also a skill that scales extremely well off of levels, so stacking levels everywhere for everyone. Now so far, my experience with build and defenses in Path of Exile 2 has probably been a little bit skewed because my first character was a warrior, and it felt super squishy. I did not finish the campaign with that character. My second character was an Archmage CI Mind Over Matter build. You know, pretty much the most disgusting thing that you can imagine, both offensively and defensively. So I really wasn't sure what to expect going into this build. Was I going to feel super squishy? Actually, no. By combining Evasion, Energy Shield, Wind Dancer, and Ghost Dance, all of this leads to a character that feels really tanky while mapping. Occasionally I did take some big damage spikes, right? Just got gibbed out of nowhere. But I'm going to be honest, a lot of that was when I was running a super rippy map and kinda knew that was going to happen anyway. And continually, I've been surprised by the fact that I can pretty much sit in the middle of a bunch of enemies, just blast them using Poisonous Concoction or the Poison Nova, without them being able to do very much to respond. This is because I keep evading their attacks. Though as a note, these defenses are way less effective against bosses, which is another reason why I don't think the build's quite there in terms of bossing. But with all that said, let's get into a few more of the details on how I built my character. Remember, this isn't perfect, it isn't super min-maxed, it's just what I've got going right now. So first up, the Pathfinder Ascendancy. There are 3 nodes that I would consider to be mandatory and 1 that's optional but really, really nice. First up, you need Poisonous Concoction. If you don't have a Brew Concoction node, you don't have a build. Next up, I highly recommend Contagious Contamination. This will significantly increase the efficacy of your clear. And then you will want Overwhelming Toxicity to double the number of poisons on targets that can be affected by your poisons. It does lower poison duration, but given how much attack speed you have, that hasn't been a significant issue. Overwhelming Toxicity also means that any modifiers that increase your poisons, say enemies can be poisoned +1 times, now effectively say enemies can be poisoned +2 times. By default, an enemy can only be poisoned once, so the build is going to want to stack a lot of these modifiers to reach the total poison count of 8 that I have available currently. And last up, Traveler's Wisdom, which, combined with a small travel node, is 6 passive points. I have gone back and forth here a lot. So first up, you are fighting bosses and struggling with your flasks. Connected Chemistry is actually pretty good. It's just straight up 50% more flask charges gained, which, when combined with a couple of flask charge gain nodes on your tree, should feel really, really good. I haven't actually used it yet. I've just taken the flask charge nodes. Even those have been mostly fine, though for big bosses like a T4 Zesht, I would recommend giving this a shot. Alternatively, if you're just mapping and you don't need any damage, running Assault lowers the movement speed penalty from skills while moving, which makes it much easier to get fast enough that you can just kind of tap your Poisonous Concoction and keep running without ever getting slowed down. This is very much a feels-good option and could be the best possible choice for a super min-maxed mapper variant. Though for a super min-maxed mapper variant, I strongly suspect that some AoE is going to need to get worked into the build so that Contagious Contamination has more than the pitiful 1.5 meter range. If anything, it's the 1.5 meter range that makes this node currently feel lackluster, because spreading poisons to enemies should be really awesome, but right now outside of breaches it doesn't do all that much, at least from my experience. So, that said, let's zoom out and take a look at some of the other notable clusters on the tree. First up, this section here is totally optional. Having fast-acting toxins and wasting does add more damage, but it is not super crucial and could easily be dropped. On the other hand, something like stacking toxins is very important. This does reduce your total poison damage by 20% by reducing the magnitude, but you can stack plenty of other magnitude nodes to effectively counteract this, such as right here, 10% increased. Well, now it's only reducing the damage by 10% because those do combine additively. If you add something like this, well, now it's reducing it by effectively 0, kind of, sort of. I mean, yes, you'd have 1.2 versus 1.0. I don't feel like getting into all the math, but because you can stack so much poison magnitude, functionally this is a very small downside for a very big upside. I'm also currently using both Escape Velocity and Freedom of Movement. I suspect these are things to drop later, but for now they feel very nice. One thing that is not up for debate is Master Fletching. 30% increased bonuses gained from equipped quiver. The way you want to do this is get as many bonuses from your equipped quiver as possible while hitting even 50% breakpoints. This is because with Widow Hail, you are massively amplifying the bonuses of things like the +2 to level of all projectile skills, which the mathematically inclined among you may note is divisible by 2. So 100% increased effect would be +2 levels, 50% increased effect is +1 level, therefore even 50% increments. In general, this means taking this entire wheel, but there might be some niche situations where you drop one or both of the side nodes. After that, come over here and pick up Subterfuge Mask. This grants a significant portion of evasion based on the energy shield on your equipped helmet, so you wear a pure ES helmet. While Blinding Strike is nice, it's certainly not required, and honestly the same goes for both Immaterial and Shimmering. These are good evasion ES nodes, definitely worth taking, but not something that you necessarily need. Coming over here, Leeching Toxins is really good. Not only do you get 30% increased magnitude of poisons, but recover life on killing a poisoned enemy. Kite Runner, not bad, it's some movement speed which helps for clearing. Also projectile speed feels nice, and projectile damage, well, it's always good to have damage. Now, I would strongly recommend Dark Entries. Not only does this increase the level of Poisonous Concoction, it also increases the level of Plague Bearer, making it an incredibly powerful option. Plus, you're going to be over here anyway, because Escalating Toxins is really good. It's effectively 100% poison duration, and Building Toxins reduces poison duration a little bit. That's fine, it's counteracted by the increased poison duration. But targets can be affected by +1 poison. Remember, all of these +1s get doubled from the Ascendancy. Then, coming over here, there's a few other interesting things. First up, Spectral Ward, maximum energy shield per 12 evasion rating on body armor. This is a nice way to get a bit of extra energy shield. Not super critical, but you're going to want to be here anyway to take Eternal Youth, so you might as well pick it up. Then over here, Wither Away, nice quality of life while mapping. The increased effective Wither is also very good for bosses. Pure Chaos is good if you are specifically using Eye of Winter to Wither. More about that in the skills section. And last but not least, Inner Faith is more evasion and energy shield, but not specifically required. Then, in terms of jewels, I'm using these. The most important thing is the increased bonuses gained from Equipped Quiver. Again, hit those 50% breakpoints, which for me is like 40-ish% total effect. I think I actually have slightly below 40. Then, things like poison duration, magnitude of poisons inflicted, also really, really good. Evasion's a nice defensive bonus, attack speed, projectile damage, all the fun stuff. Basically, if it's a bonus you take elsewhere on the tree, it's probably a good idea to take on a jewel. And also in the near future, I plan to explore some time lost jewels, so this might change very significantly. Last but not least, Prism of Belief for +3 to level of all Plague Bearer skills. How important is this? Well, my Plague Bearer at level 25 stores almost 71,000 damage. If I take this off, it now stores 27.5 thousand damage. The +3 might be expensive, but at least go for a +2. It's a super, super powerful effect. So now is a good time to talk about skills, starting with Poisonous Concoction. This deals damage in a small AoE after you throw a vial that explodes when it hits an enemy or the ground. Right now, I'm using Scattershot so that it fires 3 projectiles instead of just 1. This means you inflict 3 poisons with every hit, which is way more efficient than 1. Especially because every time you throw a vial, it eats a few flask charges. This is also why flask charge generation is so important, and also why the build feels pretty lackluster on bosses. If I was to optimize the build a little bit more for bosses, I would want some of the flask charge nodes, so something like warding potions to reduce the flask charges used, or lasting concoctions, or the nodes going up to potent concoctions, to gain additional flask charges from the flask charge generation effects. These are things that don't really matter when mapping, but are actually crucial when bossing. Now, in terms of the other supports, right now I'm using Chaos Infusion. I only really do chaos damage anyway. Martial Tempo for more attack speed. This isn't necessarily more DPS, but it feels really, really good while mapping. Deadly Poison, so the damage is lower with direct hits, but higher with poisons. And Bursting Plague, which causes the poison to build up an almost pseudo-poison effect, aka Plague, up to a maximum of 10% of an enemy's life. I recently added this because I kind of just hit level 90. I'm not 100% sure how I like it yet. I guess stay tuned for more thoughts in the future. So far, seems pretty neat though. Maybe I'll change my mind later. Now, the second skill is Vine Arrow. This is an optional thing that you only really use for single target, but on single target it does provide a pretty nice boost. It creates these fun little flowers that then cause vines to latch onto nearby enemies. With Font of Rage, gives Rage, which as you can see is ticking up damage because it's more attack damage, and that's how poisons scale. Then there's Swift Affliction. More non-ailment damage over time and less duration. I am not 100% sure. Ooh, I don't like that. Oh, it flickers. It flickers as you're losing rage. That's not fun. So I'm not 100% sure if this is worth it. However, poisoning the plant causes it to deal chaos damage per second, so non-ailment chaos damage over time. But it causes it to stick around for less time, which makes me sad because then I have to recast it, and I don't really have the mana to recast stuff. So I don't know. More damage, yes. Lower quality of life, yes. We'll see. Right now I'm running Persistence to help counteract that. And then Close Combat, which, to be completely honest, I am kind of sort of just storing here, because what I do is I swap it with Martial Tempo for some fights. Because Martial Tempo means I just run out of flask charges even faster on the boss, and having Martial Tempo here means the arrow is more responsive. So while mapping, I have Martial Tempo up like this, and then I have Close Combat just kind of chilling here, but I'm not using this skill anyway. If I get to a big boss like Zesht, I just swap them quickly, and I run Close Combat on the Poisonous Concoction, and I put Martial Tempo in the Vine Arrow. Then Despair with Focused Curse and Heightened Curse. Curse zones erupt after a 30% reduced delay, so easier to curse stuff, and Heightened Curse for increased effect, and I don't yet know what the last support's going to be. I'll get back to you later on that. Last but not least, at least for the active skills, Eye of Winter with Withering Touch. So, this is why you need Pure Chaos, because it has to do chaos damage to inflict Wither with Withering Touch. Then Arcane Tempo, quality of life through cast speed. Unleash, that way it stacks Wither even faster and the critical weakness. And Inspiration, so I don't hate myself on the mana costs. This is Eye of Winter with quality, it shoots out a bunch of projectiles. It's really good at fully withering and inflicting critical weakness on a boss. Now, passively, the build has currently 120 spirit worth of skills. First being Ghost Dance. Every 3.1 seconds, you gain a Ghost Shroud. Now, when you get hit and have a Ghost Shroud, it's consumed, and you get Energy Shield back. The amount of Energy Shield recovered is based on evasion. So, more evasion equals more Energy Shield back. This is why the build, or at least part of why the build, is so deceptively tanky, because the hits that do make it through your evasion often get blocked by Ghost Dance and erased in their entirety. Next up, Alchemist's Boon. This grants flask charges per second, which is a very good way to help recharge your flasks, especially for pesky boss fights. Next up, Plague Bearer. This stores expected poison damage to create a big old AoE, aka Poison Nova. Then Magnified Effect for even more AoE, Chaos Mastery, +1 level, Physical Mastery, +2 levels, and Astral Projection, so instead of just casting it around your character, you can now cast it at a distance, which is really, really nice. Though, as a note, it doesn't always cast through or around terrain. And you get this fun little effect, where there's a poison bubble around your head if you don't have any Plague Store. Last up, Wind Dancer, another defensive buff, where you get more evasion rating per stage. With 4 stages, that's quite a bit of extra evasion. And every time you get hit, you use an attack that can maim, blind, and otherwise ruin an enemy's day. Though I'll admit I don't think the culling has ever been relevant, but hey, I had the extra sockets, so I figured might as well. Next up, the gearing. So, this is the Widow Hail that I'm using. The bonuses gained from Equipped Quiver, really, really important that between this, your nodes on the tree, and your jewels, you want to hit an even increment of 50%, because that gives +1 to prod skills. Now, higher is better. Technically, 300% on Widow Hail, plus I believe it's 80% on the tree, plus as many jewels as possible. That would be the best case scenario. That's also kind of sort of unlimited money territory. So something like a 286, much more reasonable. If you cannot afford a 286, even just a regular old 240 something, 250, 260, all totally fine alternatives. Just keep in mind the lower it goes, the more likely you're going to miss out on 1 level's worth of damage, thus have lower DPS than what I do here. And then the 2 soul cores for attack speed are purely for quality of life. Fun fact, you can put as Kappa soul cores in here, get spirit if you're struggling to fit auras. I have not yet done that though, because I can't think of another aura to add, at least for the time being. And then there's this beautiful quiver, which provides a lot of attack speed, +2 to prod skills, and some quality of life stuff. As a note, the 30% increased damage with bow skills should be fixed. There was a bug that was allowing it to apply to Poisonous Concoction, despite this being a non-bow skill. There might be some weirdness with tooltips, but that should be fixed, so that line should be doing nothing. I just happened to have it because this was the cheapest quiver on the market at the time that had the projectile skills. The attack speed was on an attack speed base and had proj speed. In terms of other stats, attack, crit, strike chance, and dexterity are also pretty good, but this is a cheap quiver and I'm probably going to upgrade it later, so I just bought the first thing on the market. Something else that I strongly recommend that you go out of your way to buy is Snakebite. Targets can be affected by +1 of your poisons at the same time, which is actually +2. So this is a significant damage boost because you go from 6 poisons to 8 poisons, which is basically 33% more DPS. Pretty darn good, I'd say. Though it does mean you give up your glove slot, which is slightly unfortunate. Now for your helmet, I recommend getting as much energy shield as possible, then some life, and for the suffixes, intelligence, resistances, maybe some chaos res, maybe even some item rarity. I happened to find this helmet for a pretty low price. When I got it, it was not fully crafted, so instead of having the beautiful 322 energy shield, had like 210, 215, I think. And then I added quality and I added the iron rune, and that energy shield shot way up. Actually, it might have been like 230, 240. Either way, it was relatively inexpensive in the state where I bought it. Then, after I finished crafting it, the value went way up. Pretty darn good helmet. Probably going to be reselling it soon as I swap to something else, because I kind of want to go CI, which means the life will no longer be relevant. Now this chest piece, also good bit of life, good bit of evasion, good bit of energy shield. I kind of went back and forth on whether I wanted a pure evasion chest or if I wanted an evasion ES chest, and at the very least for the life-based version of the build, I would strongly recommend going evasion energy shield, because going evasion energy shield as opposed to pure evasion results in much higher total energy shield. I'm pretty sure if I just had a 2.2k-ish evasion chest piece here, I would only have about half the total ES that I have right now, and I wouldn't gain that much chance to evade. I'd gain a little bit, but after 86%, the diminishing returns are so high, it would probably only go to like 90, 91, which is good if Wind Dancer falls off, but otherwise isn't necessarily the best option, especially not when you can have a much bigger buffer, which is a bigger total HP pool, so you can take a larger hit. After all, being able to recover all 1.5k of your energy shield doesn't matter if something hits you for, say, 4.5k, which I would very barely survive in this gear, and I would not survive if I only had 1.5k ES. Also, if you're wondering why this energy shield is missing, that's because of Eternal Youth. Don't worry, you can just life flask it back. For a belt, life's good. Armor, I guess, might in theory do something someday. Doesn't really do anything, just happens to be on the item. At least one charm slot is nice, but if you can get two, that's better, and aside of that, just look for some resistances. Now for boots, prioritize movement speed. You definitely want at least 20, if not 30%. After that, life is good. The more life you have, the higher your stun threshold, which is particularly helpful, and the better your general survivability. Then, look for things like dexterity or intelligence, as this is a dual attribute build, so attributes are pretty darn important. Then fill things in with, well, resistances. If you have something like Evasion Energy Shield, it's certainly nice, but think of it as icing on the cake rather than a requirement. For rings, I'm not really going to go into too much detail here. It's just generic life res attributes, exactly the same as before. If you happen to be able to get fizz damage to attacks or item rarity, these are pretty nice ways to get a little bit of an extra damage boost or a little bit extra loot boost. Again, though, don't worry too much and focus on the suffixes, plus get a good life roll. Last up, your amulet, where you're going to instill lasting trauma. There are two stats that are incredibly important here. The first is the +3 to level of all projectile skills, or +2 level of all. Doesn't have to specifically be 3. And the second is the spirit, which means +1 aura, or you can think of it as saving money and not having to use as kappa in your weapon. After that, intelligence or dexterity, really good on amulet. This is a great place to get extra attributes. Fire, cold, lightning, chaos res, definitely a good place to get it. And if you can get some energy shield or some evasion rating, that'll feel pretty good as well. But I wouldn't worry too much about the prefixes minus the spirit. You could even get some maximum life or increased maximum life. But I happen to notice that the increased maximum life / maximum life ones were a lot more expensive in this one, and I didn't plan to stay life energy shield hybrid long term, so I didn't think it was worth it. As for lasting trauma, the reduced attack speed is truly unfortunate. Kinda hurts while clearing, but for single target, not really much of a factor, and it gives a massive magnitude and duration of damaging ailments. So it is a whole bunch of damage with a unfortunate downside that you kinda just have to put up with. Admittedly, if you don't want to put up with that downside, a really good alternative would be wasting, which you can take and then drop all of these nodes here and invest into either damage or defenses elsewhere. Maybe grab some of those flask nodes that I mentioned. For the life flask, gain charges per second and increased life recovered. Should be pretty straightforward as to why this is good. Technically, this isn't increased life recovered, this is increased energy shield recovered, but hey, basically the same difference. And the ultimate mana flask, the only thing that actually really matters is the bottom part, the gain charges per second. Removing mana recovered from life when used, you do not want this as a CI build because it will kill you instantly. The funny thing is, I don't actually need to have this key bound. I don't need any of the mana flask recovery, because the point of a mana flask is just to fuel my concoction, which doesn't cost mana, it just costs mana flask charges. So as long as I'm able to spend those charges, which does not remove any of my life, it's fine. And when I run out of charges, I don't do damage, which unfortunately did happen when I took on a T4 Zesht. And last up, for charms, Stone Charm to avoid stun, Thawing Charm to avoid freeze, Gold Charm because why not, yay extra loot, I honestly don't even know if it's impactful. So those are my passives, skills, and general gearing for the current version of my character. Now I know that was quite a bit, so do be sure to use the timestamps to jump back into the video, rewatch any sections if you're confused. On the other hand, if you want to see everything laid out, I'm going to have a POB in my build link archive in Discord, and I'm also going to have a link to a actual planner down in the description of the video. So if you find the planner helpful, don't forget to give it a rating. With all that said, how have my gameplay experiences been? Well, pretty great actually. I've been surprised at how effective this build has performed, both in terms of mapping, and also in terms of some pretty deadly stuff. For example, in this map I got all the breaches. Now, on my previous character, I found that my energy shield was a bit fragile, where very often it would get completely blown away if I stood next to too many breach monsters. Now, however, I'm more or less able to stand directly in the middle of all the breach monsters. There are times where my energy shield takes a couple hits, but for the most part it doesn't really move, because on the rare occasion where I am getting hit, Ghost Dance triggers and immediately restores energy shield. So this feels really, really good, and having the Eternal Youth provides another layer of recovery where I can just hit my life flask and immediately gain ES back should I lose it. And yes, I know, I am leaving a complete mess everywhere. Don't worry, I'm going to pick it up after I'm done recording. But right now the video comes first, and you know, all the breach splinters look pretty shiny on the floor. Just don't step on them, because that stuff, if you think a radioactive spider bite's bad, breach splinters, it'll ruin your life. Also your entire family's life. But okay, that's just a regular old map. What about something a little bit more deadly? Like a Tier 17 map. Well, Tier 17 is really easy as well, including the bosses. They don't quite instantly die in Tier 17, but they don't exactly last very long, and I feel quite able to dodge around, or even take a hit or two should the boss manage to clip me. Though with the wrong modifiers, I do suspect that bosses are the one place where this build would die, since evasion doesn't work on the big slam type moves and they're usually really high fizz damage, which is this build's one weakness. But hey, that's what moving out of the way is for. And I also took this into a Tier 15 map with about 50% Delirious. And to be honest with you, I didn't notice the difference between 50% Delirious and 0% Delirious. It's a little hard to calculate exactly how much damage the poisons are doing. Even POB is maybe a little bit buggy at the moment. All I know is it does yes levels of damage and stuff dies really, really efficiently. This is also a perfect example of why Plague Nova is so good, because if a tanky rare happens to pop up, just drop a Plague Nova on it and that rare no longer exists. But with that said, as good as the build has felt so far, there is one place where the build has not felt great. That was Zesht. Now, clearing all the way to the boss, perfect. Felt really, really good. But once I got to the boss, I ran into the problem of immediately bursting the boss to about half health, and having to dodge a couple mechanics, and running out of flask charges. And remember, all of this build's damage is from flask charges. Now, I did not get hit by any of the big slams in the fight, but for everything else, I was able to tank them without issue. It just happened to be that the fight got pretty long and rather painful, since without flask charges the build doesn't do damage. There are two ways to solve this. One, get more damage, kill the boss faster, profit. 2, invest in some of the flask nodes on the tree, or get some better belt modifiers for reduced flask charges used or increased flask charges gained. I'm not exactly sure which route I'm going to go. I'm probably going to experiment or maybe see which items are cheap and which items are expensive, but either way, this is something that should be very fixable. Just for now, I wouldn't really recommend the build in its current form as a boss killer. Though I guess if you're not doing T4 bosses, it's probably not going to be an issue because you'll burst the boss down before you run out of flask charges. And so that's been my experience so far playing Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder. Now, in comparison to the Path of Exile 1 Poisonous Concoction build, It's actually pretty close to spot on in terms of a class fantasy. About the only thing that doesn't quite jive with me is how small of a radius is on contagious contamination. I don't know, those screen-wide poison prolifs from PoE 1 were pretty sweet, and that's something I'm kind of missing here. That said, maybe I can sneak up and grab AoE nodes somewhere. I actually don't know if there are generic non-spell tagged AoE nodes on the tree anywhere near where my character is, so I'll have to see if that's even possible. But if it is, that might be cool. And if not, the build's still pretty darn good, because it feels great to just drop a Plague Nova and completely obliterate everything within the radius. So, in terms of plans for the future, fix my flask charges for single target, either by getting more damage or just getting more flask charges, continue to improve the defenses, and go Chaos Inoculation. Going Chaos Inoculation means all I have to worry about is keeping my energy shield stable. Don't have to worry about my life at all at that point. It should also mean that I can get higher energy shield on gear to get an even higher health pool, which hopefully should prevent any one-shots. I don't know exactly how high I'll need, but I'm going to aim for like 5-6k with Grim Feast to allow it to stack up to like 12k, because if I can get it to 12k with Grim Feast, I'm pretty sure I'm going to feel damn near invincible. Now, once I tweak the build, I do plan to make another video, but I think that one's going to be a little bit different, because these full in-depth build guides are a lot of work, and when I make multiple full in-depth build videos on the same build, I kind of feel like I'm just going insane saying the exact same things over and over and over again. So instead, this is going to be my only full in-depth build guide style video on Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder. I don't exactly know what I'm going to do in the future, but it's going to be something smaller, less edit intensive, and probably more of a showcase than a full guide. So if that sounds interesting and you want to see where the character ends up, do be sure to get subscribed, and maybe let me know down below what sort of content you'd like to see showcased in that video. Depending on when you comment, I can't guarantee it's going to make it into the final video, but you never know. There's at least a few days here. After all, I still need to figure out some of the optimizations, but hey, that's going to be all for me today. Thanks for watching to the end. Glad you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.